What would happen if you went to sleep and woke up in the year 1713? What would your daily life be like? Would you survive? Welcome back to another episode of In My Head, the channel that gets you thinking about the most fascinating topics. We do things differently here at In My Head, providing captivating content structured around addressing thought-provoking questions. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on any of our mind-blowing uploads. The past is both a beautiful and frightening place. It is fun to venture into the past through a film or other form of media. But living in the past is entirely different. What would happen if you went to sleep and woke up in 1713? What would you do? Your situation depends largely on where you end up. If you end up in 713's America and are white, you would at least be able to earn your bread. America at this time was filled with plantations that were owned by rich landowners and worked on by slaves of African descent. Your gender is another factor that will determine your experience in the past. In most countries in 1713, gender roles were specified, and they were expected to be adhered to. If you were a girl, you would not be allowed to hold public office or vote. Girls during this period were expected to concern themselves with the care of their household and following society's ideals. Although, due to the heavy presence of capitalism during this era, wealthy women had the option of owning slaves and even going to college, which might not sound like a big deal today. But back then, women couldn't even think about furthering their education as they desired. Academic pursuits were considered to be an exclusively male activity. So, unless you somehow happened upon a ton of wealth, 1713 isn't such a great time for you if you're a woman. Though this was a male-dominated era, that doesn't mean the men were having a great time. In 1713's America, large families were very common, as this was the social security of the time. Infant mortality was expected, so couples had many children, knowing that they'd at least have half of them left. You can also say goodbye to your comfortable clothes. If you wound up in 1713, you'd have to settle for homespun garments. Unless you somehow gain access to a fortune, homespun garments are the only clothing you'd be able to afford. During this period, you can tell a person's class by simply looking at them. Your dress will affect how you are treated. People who wore clothes made with fine materials that signified wealth were treated with respect, but no respect was shown to those who wore the plain clothing of the lower classes. As for food, you'll be growing your own food, at least most of what you eat. And you'll need to eat healthy food because you really can't afford to be sick. No one can. Medicine was mostly ineffective. Doctors were rare, poorly trained, and viewed with low esteem by the general populace. Like I said, not the greatest time to be alive. As for housing, you would most likely be living in a log cabin. There is also the possibility that you will be forced to resort to indentured servitude, which will require you to occupy a service position for 5 to 7 years. Indentured servitude is just a step above slavery, and not too big of a step. Indentured servants do backbreaking work daily, and are neither paid nor allowed to marry. That being said, people in 1713's America were better off than those who lived in contemporary England. 1713's England kind of sucked to live in. One major challenge you are likely to encounter in England 1713 is the ridiculous economic inequality. The rich during this period were really rich, and the poor were extremely poor. The chances of moving from one extreme to the other were also very slim, as the class division was quite rigid. Though the Industrial Revolution is still decades away, 1713 is brimming with technological development. At this point, the wealth gap is already expanding. The rich are getting richer, and the poor are getting poorer. Also, the development in technology suddenly thrust hundreds of thousands of people out of work, drastically increasing poverty. At this time, London was already overcrowded, with a population of 600,000. Many people were out of work, because suddenly machines were doing their jobs. The population was growing wildly. Cities were dirty, noisy, and overcrowded. London had about 600,000 people around 1700, and almost 1 million residents in 1800. The wealthy, however, were having a splendid time. The rich, only a tiny minority of the population, lived in luxurious mansions and threw dinner parties, attended operas, and the theater. Most of the rich people during this time had inherited their wealth and grew up rich. They never had to work, cook meals, or empty their own chamber pots. Poor people, on the other hand, ate rather simple diets, and most people were malnourished. Most meals were composed of either bread or potatoes. Meat was a rare privilege. One of the results of the terrible poverty during this period was a rise in crime. To combat this, the laws were adjusted so that the police had more power and simple crimes could lead to severe punishments. London was Europe's jail capital. Punishments ranged from standing in the pillory to branding, whipping, and burning. Death is the penalty for over 200 different offenses. Even children are being hanged. This is not a good time to be on trial, so you'll have to be very careful not to break any laws. It is possible to survive in 1713, but even if you do, you'll most likely not enjoy your time there. People back then were so sick of their environment that most people turned to alcoholism to escape the harshness of their reality. With the luxuries you're accustomed to, luxuries such as running water, electricity, internet, etc., living in 1713 will have you attempting to build a time machine. And we don't know how to build time machines, so let's hope that doesn't happen to anyone. That brings us to the end of today's video, all about surviving a surprise trip to 1713. What part of this one interested you the most? Get involved and let us know in the comments section down below. If you enjoyed today's episode and found it interesting, make sure to leave us a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe to In My Head to be kept up to date with the most exciting content as soon as it's uploaded. Thanks for watching. See you again soon in another video.